In the 1970s, amid dropping levels of wagon-load freight across the British railway network, a scheme was devised to revitalise interest in transferring goods from individual clients by train known as Speedlink, a fully refreshed wagon-load system that was tailor-made for the highly reduced nature of the UK's rail transport industry. Sadly, this ambitious program would be discontinued after just over a decade in a controversial political decision that essentially handed client-based goods traffic to the road network in its entirety on the grounds of cost saving. And today, wagon-load freight is now but a fading part of the UK railway industry's long and varied history. Wagon-load freight, as a method of cargo conveyance, had existed since the infancy of the railway network, as in a time when the newly established train travel was starting to present a faster and more efficient method of transporting goods against the archaic and slow-moving canal and road system. Hundreds of individual clients across the UK's industrial heartland commissioned the building of their own spurs and sidings that allowed for direct access to the wider mainline railway network. Each of these companies would buy their own wagons onto which their goods would be placed, and then attached to the rear of a specially organised service which would visit each siding to pick up and drop off these wagons on assigned dates. The most enduring symbols of this freight conveyance system being the hundreds of goods stations established usually next to passenger stations that were dotted across the nation, providing an easily accessible platform facility for the loading and unloading of freight. Once the railway network had truly propagated across the entire country, with nearly every major city and town served by at least one line, the main modes of transferring goods comprised both wagon-load freight, but also block unit trains which comprised a single commodity and would usually serve either one or two customers. Examples of this included lengthy coal trains that would run a dedicated route between the mines and collieries to power stations and other users of domestic coal on a day-to-day basis, with the train not being required to remove or pick up additional wagons throughout the course of its journey. Wagon-load freight, meanwhile, reached the peak of its influence during the early 20th century, as with industrial output at its very maximum, while lorry alternatives were still fledgling on a largely underdeveloped road network, the big four railway companies of the UK had an essential monopoly on the transfer of goods for individual clients, who by this point were able to specify their own wagon designs so as to cater to their various needs. Examples included specially built wagons to convey dangerous goods such as explosives or toxic chemicals, while the railway operators, for a nominal fee, would attach and drop off these wagons at the specific sidings of each of the customers, presenting perhaps one of the most flexible and efficient forms of transportation available for the period when transferring cargo products. The situation, however, wasn't completely in the railway's favour, as even early on in the history of train travel, the speed and efficiency exhibited by this new form of transportation meant it was quickly apparent that the various rail companies could easily impose a harsh monopoly on those clients they were wishing to serve. In this capacity, the railways could decide whatever price they deemed fit for customers, with the threat that non-compliance would make the transfer of their product by canal barge or horse and wagon far slower than their competitors, who paid the fee to use freight trains, and thus costing them their profitability and commercial edge. The British Parliament responded to this concern in 1830 with the Carriers Act, the first legislative intervention in the field of the carriage of goods, and was applied to all common carriers by land, including both roads and railways, the stipulation of the Carriers Act being to hold conveyors of goods to certain requirements in order to deliver a fair and consistent service for their clients. This was followed by additional legislation throughout the course of the 1800s, which legally bound the railway network as a common carrier, which obligated the rail companies to provide carriage for virtually any type of goods, regardless of quantity, large or small, from any two stations on the network at certain published rates. As mentioned, the introduction of this legislation was to prevent the railways from abusing their monopoly as the sole practical long-distance transport provider for much of the country, although with the rise of road transport in the 1930s and 40s, this quickly became a millstone around the neck of the big four railway operators of the grouping era. Road freight operators during these early days had no legal restrictions and could turn down work that was uneconomic, while the railway firms had not the ability to do so, meaning road hauliers could easily undercut the rail system's fixed rates. This headache was brought initially into light during the Great Depression of 1929, when the big four railway companies campaigned for the common carrier status of the railway system to be repealed in the face of falling cargo demand as companies sought cheaper modes of transportation, a situation that nearly brought about the bankruptcy of both the LMS and the LNER during the early 1930s. It wasn't until after the end of World War II in 1945 and the subsequent nationalisation of a broken and bankrupt railway system into British Railways in 1948 did it become clear how hamstrung the UK's rail freight operators were due to the common carrier status, the exponential rise of road transport, including the start of motorway building in the mid to late 1950s, only serving to see lorries and vans rapidly move in to undercut the railways and steal vast chunks of their cargo business. The common carrier requirements also demanded that British Railways maintain thousands of goods yards and other facilities, plus rolling stock and staff to serve them, even when there was an ever-decreasing actual demand for such services, and such traffic as did exist was very rarely profitable. These problems were exacerbated by the infamous rail strike of May 1955, wherein the Railway Drivers' Union, ASLEF, called a 4-week strike in protest against the award of the Railway Staff National Tribunal, which proposed a shrinkage in the existing differentials enjoyed by the footplate grades. This strike, which led to a state of emergency being declared on May 31st of that year, seeing many of even the most faithful railway customers flock to road transport and never return. Very soon, freight conveyance had become a financial black hole for the nationalised rail operator, and attempts to redress the balance under the 1955 modernisation plan only served to compound the problem. One of the main requirements of this massive scheme being for the large-scale introduction of gigantic marshalling yards at various strategic locations across the nation to serve what was perceived by British Railways to be a flourishing wagonload freight market. The reality was that when this sector of the market collapsed towards the end of the decade, all of these expensive facilities were rendered obsolete within years of their opening, while other attempts to improve the efficiency of system operations through mass dieselization were carried out in such a flawed manner that they ultimately only added to the significant losses being incurred by the ailing railway firm, meaning more fundamental improvements to the network could not be brought to fruition, such as widespread electrification. Worse still was the rise of containerized freight, which replaced a traditional shipping system of boxes and crates by the middle of the 1960s on a vast scale, with this new form of conveyance immediately exploited by the road hauliers, but was very late to be introduced by British Rail, who only introduced their own dedicated container freight arm in 1968 with the Freightliner sector. Freightliner operated unit trains between designated container ports located at a number of vital areas across the UK, with the start of Freightliner essentially rendering all the work carried out to improve wagon-load freight under the modernisation plan completely obsolete, with marshalling yards slashed by 1/3 by 1965 and 60% of goods stations and yards closed by the same year. However, despite the cuts, the continued requirement of BR to perform as a common carrier meant the volume of freight carried by the company was unaffected, with the wagon-load freight sector making a loss of £40 million by 1966 against a figure of £54 million in 1961, with no improvement in profitability achieved, even though wagon-load freight accounted for 2/3 of British Rail's cargo revenue. As a direct result of the losses incurred by both the general downturn in traffic and the wasteful spending of the ultimately unsuccessful modernisation plan, the 1963 Reshaping of British Railways report, as written by Dr. Richard Beeching, outlined that in order to keep railway operations afloat, major cuts to the entire network needed to be made. Therefore, 4,000 miles of line were closed between 1965 and 1973 under what was known as the Beeching Acts, while by 1972, only 124 of the original 600 marshalling yards operating a decade earlier remained open, the Beeching cuts having only a limited effect on freight traffic, as the overall sector incurred a mere 30% reduction based directly on the downsizing of the network. The direction of rail cargo traffic by this point was squarely set on high-efficiency unit trains, which acted as essentially long-distance high-speed conveyor belts, examples including the merry-go-round services, which provided a near-constant rolling supply of coal between the collieries and the power stations, as well as the Freightliner intermodal system, which allowed for containerized traffic to be transferred up and down the nation in a manner that was far quicker and easier to utilize than wagon-load freight. However, in spite of the strict reductions being made to the wagon-load freight sector, and with there being a general uncertainty as to what the future of this system would be as British Rail continued to strive for a more efficient, though heavily downsized network, the firm was not yet willing to completely abandon wagon-load freight operations. One of the more obvious problems with the remaining services was its use of archaic rolling stock, which dated back up to and before World War II, with designs that comprised unfitted or vacuum brake-fitted vans and trucks that were not suited to the increased speeds of the modern railway system, BR responding through two primary methods to resolve this pervasive issue. The first was the High-Speed Freight Vehicle or HSFV project of the mid-1960s, which sought to overcome various infrastructure-related developments in wagon-load freight trains when traveling at speeds above 40 miles an hour, while the second was the creation of air brake-fitted freight stock, which meant that the braking of the entire consist could be done evenly among the wagons themselves, rather than relying solely on the braking systems of the locomotive and/or a brake van within the train set. This would also replace the vacuum-braked fleet of wagons that had been on the decline since the end of steam, thereby allowing services to slow for stops later than before, and also eradicating another common safety issue of unfitted freight trains running away due to the braking of the locomotive not being enough to stop or slow the train within safe parameters. Testing of air brake-fitted rolling stock commenced in 1972, and after a lengthy period of development, British Rail were ready to relaunch Wagonload Freight in the UK under a new brand sector in September 1977, which, after much deliberation among the BR board, was dubbed Speedlink, replacing its proposed original name of Air Braked Freight or ABF. Speedlink was considered a traditional freight operation wherein individual wagons originated from various separate localities and were shunted into a single train, after which the consist would be transferred to a specified routing point and be dispersed to individual destinations. This service, being faster than existing freights, had higher haulage capacity and did not require huge marshalling yards in order to operate. However, unlike the previous wagon-load freight operation, Speedlink was a much more restricted service in order to reflect the general decline of customer-based freight systems within the UK, using fixed timetables between a more limited number of destinations that, as mentioned, made for a faster service with higher reliability on delivery times. By 1984, Speedlink was running 150 trunk services per day, with a peak 8 million tons of cargo carried each year, while operating to 24 main and secondary distribution sites with around 800 potential sidings as destinations, the BR board stating in 1983 that the service had reached profitability and, upon its formation on January 4, 1982, was placed under the auspices of the newly established General Railfreight Division. This division received its own distinguishing red, yellow and grey livery as part of the sectorisation process of British Rail during the first half of the decade, allowing a greater degree of autonomy among the various sectors that could be tailored to their individual demands and conditions. Not long after the formation of the railfreight sector, though, the firm became conscious that, based on its varied operations to different clients and areas of the wider UK industry, further subsectors would be required in order to demarcate traffic into individual users, with the prospect of making freight by rail more attractive to potential customers, while also improving performance and efficiency on an individual basis. Thus, on October 15, 1987, the trainload business sectors were formed, each of which adopted the distinctive triple grey livery, but would be broken up through the use of individual decals into the petroleum, coal, metals and construction sectors. Another resultant of this would be the creation of a dedicated parcels sector, which was tasked with the conveyance of mail and other parcels traffic upon the British Rail network, and would be rebranded on October 11, 1991 to Rail Express Systems as part of the forthcoming but ultimately unsuccessful RailNet project. On October 10, 1988, the operations of Speedlink and Freightliner, under what was known as the short-lived Railfreight General sector of the 1987 reorganisation, were merged under the then new brand of Railfreight Distribution, which would not only manage non-trainload freight services, but was also envisaged to be the main operator of freight running through the proposed Channel Tunnel to France, which was scheduled to open in 1994. Railfreight Distribution, which was headquartered at Tournament House near Paddington Station in London, also sported 12 individual subordinate offices in Allerton on Merseyside, Dollans Moor near the proposed Channel Tunnel portal at Folkestone, Trafford Park in Manchester, Birmingham, Moss End near Glasgow, Wakefield in Yorkshire, Crewe in Cheshire, Saltley in the West Midlands, Derby in the East Midlands, Tinsley near Sheffield, and Wembley and Willesden in North London, each of which were usually supported by either a large marshalling yard, Freightliner port or stabling point. While initially profitable when working under the newly formed Railfreight Distribution sector, fortunes for Speedlink changed rapidly due to the influence of the early 1990s recession caused by the Gulf War of 1991, during which the demand for shipping dropped, and the Speedlink operations went from making a profit of £42 million in 1989 to a £28 million loss for 1990. A review of operations undertaken by external consultants stated that the trainload freight sectors could only be profitable on journeys of over 500 miles with substantial loadings of at least 10 wagons per day, while anything short of this figure could easily be mopped up by road haulage. Thus, the Conservative government of anti-rail Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, who demanded that BR be a commercially viable business in all segments so as not to require generous government subsidies, eventually forced the company's hand when it came to the future of its now ailing wagon-load freight sector. As such, on July 8, 1991, Speedlink was abolished, with Railfreight distribution required to replace its remaining 125 services per day with brand new operations that came under the Tiger Rail brand, which would run freight train services from Cornwall and Hampshire in the south to Scotland in the north, while British Rail would commence a new container service from northeast Scotland to Glasgow on a trial basis to replace wagon-load alternatives. Approximately 70% of the domestic Speedlink traffic would subsequently be retained on rail, although the axing of the brand was seen with considerable controversy by the national press, as it was noted that the move to slash this dedicated mark was seen as British Rail essentially handing over the short-haul wagon-load freight market to road haulage in a time when environmental considerations sought to reduce dependence on vans and lorries, blaming political malice and the pursuit of profits on its demise, rather than for the ease of logistical operations. This wasn't entirely the end of wagon-load freight on Britain's railways, though, as aside from the continued operation of certain domestic services, in September 1992, at a special exhibition held in Birmingham, Railfreight Distribution announced the launch of a dedicated wagon-load freight service with Europe called Freightconnection. This, in partnership with the French, Belgian and German railways, would provide direct-through services to continental Europe, initially via Dover to connect with the Dunkirk train ferry, and later the Channel Tunnel upon its opening on May 6, 1994, from all principal industrial locations in Britain. This move was commemorated in the repainting of 4 Class 90 electric locomotives in special liveries with matching Freightconnection nameplates translated into the language of their respective nation they represented, with 9128 Frachtverbindung in SNCB blue and yellow, 9129 Frachtverbindungen in the red and white of Deutsche Bundesbahn, 9130 Freightconnection in SNCF orange and two-tone grey, and 9022 Freightconnection, which sported a newly revised Railfreight distribution livery. Ultimately, the Freightconnection scheme retained 85% of existing train ferry traffic by the time the Channel Tunnel became operational for Railfreight distribution cargo services in June 1994, with the sector's usage of the tunnel being on the basis of paying yearly guaranteed sums of money to Eurotunnel until 2005, which would total a net figure of £242 million. Unfortunately, due to various logistical problems and political wrangling, together with the delayed introduction of the dual-voltage Class 92 locomotives dedicated for tunnel work, thus requiring the brief hiring of SNCF BB 22200 electrics to do the work in their stead, the optimistic forecasts for Channel Tunnel work by the sector were not to be met, and by March 1996, Railfreight Distribution's accounts indicated a total loss of £64.5 million had been incurred on their cargo services to and from France. Beyond dedicated wagon-load services through the Channel Tunnel, what operations remained were transferred to British Rail's regional trainload sectors Mainline Freight, Loadhaul and Transrail, the latter of whom established their own dedicated long-distance wagon-load freight service known as Enterprise in 1994, which continued to be operated even after the buyout of this firm by EWS in 1996, where it was retained as EWS Enterprise. Meanwhile, from 1990, a road rail intermodal service named Charter Rail was established to serve potential customers post-Speedlink using piggyback wagons provided by Tiphook, and will be worked in a manner similar to piggyback trains found in Europe and the United States, where lorry trailers are transferred for a majority of their journey aboard a train, the company eventually going into liquidation in 1992 due to high locomotive haulage rates which made the enterprise unsustainable. Despite the cutbacks, wagon-load services, in an official capacity, continued until December 2017, when DB Cargo would eventually see off the last of its remaining trainload contracts as a mixture of cost-cutting, together with a general move of the UK economy away from manufacturing to a service-based industry, meant the justification to continue providing freight services on an individual customer basis was no longer viable. Instead, rail operators going into the 2020s would find greater value in working lengthy long-distance unit trains that could easily outperform vans and lorries on cross-country runs, although with prevailing attitudes favouring environmentally friendly modes of transportation, the potential still exists for wagon-load freight traffic to resume once again and the railways to return to serving on a client-by-client basis. Therefore, Speedlink proved to be the very pinnacle of individual customer-based rail freight transportation, and thus the closest British Rail would come to providing a direct competitor to the access provided by lorries and trucks during the 1980s, with its yearly profits during this period demonstrating the theory behind Speedlink was indeed sound. Sadly, with the onset of the recession during 1990, Speedlink would become an easy target for a government seeking to streamline and cut down British Rail in as many ways as possible during the early groundwork of the privatisation process. And with its losses mounting as demand by customers fell away, the system would end up in the crosshairs of this rationalisation, thus sparking the beginning of the end of one of Britain's oldest aspects of rail transportation.